So let's see, last time we did this kind of crazy derivation. Let's actually back up to this slide. So we're looking at a pretty general setup here. There are some features x, and there are some labels y, and the way that the labels are related to the features is basically due to some true model function f, which in general we never know, plus here's some additive noise epsilon. And all we're saying about the noise is that it's zero mean and it has some finite variance. We would like to predict y from x. So we come up with a model we call f hat, which is in general different than f. And our model depends on some training parameters beta. In order to set those parameters, we're going to do, we're going to somehow set them from the training data. So all we're saying here really is that these particular beta, they're determined by this training data. We think of the training data as random, so therefore the beta hats are also random. And finally, what we want to do is we want to measure the mean squared error of our prediction of y from x. And so the mean squared error says, on average, this is a statistical average over all the training data, so all those random training features, training labels, as well as over this random test noise. So averaging over all that stuff, it's asking how good is the squared error on y for a particular set of test features x. Okay, so that's what we want to do. And then we had this long derivation that said that quantity, that mean squared error, can be written as a sum of three terms. This irreducible error, which we can never really do anything about. Then we have a squared bias term. The bias tells us how close y and y hat, our predictions are, on average for a fixed x. And then finally we have the variance, which sort of tells you how far y hat is from the average y hat squared on average. So just how much does y hat move around its average? Okay, so those are the three terms. And okay, so I don't think I talked about this, but so this derivation, we did this for a fixed x. So that means that this mean squared error can change as you change the test training features. But you might say, well, in practice, I don't actually know what those training features, the test features will be. I don't know what they're going to be, so I don't really care about any particular test features. I just want to know how good is this going to be on average over my average test features that I might encounter. So if you want that, you take this x-dependent quantity and you do one more average over that x, over those test features. And then we will get just the average mean squared error on y hat. So we'll talk about that as well. There's really not too much we can do to these expressions to simplify things. We just need to take the average of this over x, or actually average of the squared bias over x, and we just need to take the average of the x conditional variance over x. So I guess notationally, if you wanted, you could write this as just variance y hat, because this expectation kind of kills this. But this one, I don't think this can be simplified really. No, can't. Okay, so that's what we found. So now I'm going to hopefully explain all this a lot better using this polynomial demo. I think this is one of the coolest demos of the semester. So this is how it goes. Let me recall, we had some pictures back here somewhere. Okay, these are good ones. So this was our polynomial experiment. So every time we run this experiment, we generate a set of random XY pairs, and for a particular hypothesized model order, in this case it's 1, we compute this least squares model. So when the model order is 1, we're computing a line. That line depends on all our training samples. So every time I do this experiment, that blue line changes a little, or green line changes a little bit, right? Because I have slightly different training data. The same thing can be done for any model order, like in this case d equals 15, except instead of a line we have a curve, and this curve is a lot more wiggly than the true red model. And of course, every time I generate a new training data set, I'm going to have a slightly different green curve. Okay, so now what we do in this experiment over here, to understand all this bias variance stuff, what we did is we did 100,000 independent experiments. Okay, ran that code 100,000 times. And I did that because if I want to compute a quantity like this, if I want to do this analytically, I have to be able to do all these expectations analytically in the variance with integrals, and that is kind of a mess, especially with the polynomial model. So we can't do that. So as a way of estimating these quantities, what I did is I essentially did what's called a Monte Carlo average, which is like a sample average over all these different combinations of x and y and everything, like 100,000 times. So it's a really good average, so we can trust it. Okay, so essentially so we're really trying to evaluate that statistical expectation, the statistical variance, but I had to do it with just 100,000 averages. Okay, so in this first column, we have the situation where when we did the modeling, we used the linear model, d equals 1. Okay, so what you see here as the green line, the green line is the average. What's this? This is the average prediction given x. So let's take a particular x here. Let's imagine that we're focusing on x is 0.5. So if I want to know what is the average y hat over these 100,000 experiments when x was 0.5, that green line tells me it was right there. Okay. Now, remember that every time I did that experiment, that changed a little bit because I have a slightly different linear model. And so I also looked at the variance of my prediction given x. How much did it change around its average value? And I plotted that using these error bars. So right at that point here, you can see, or this is actually showing you the standard deviation. So it wiggled up and down with that kind of standard deviation. Okay, so when you look at these different standard deviations, one thing you notice is that you have shorter bars in the middle, longer bars on the edges. So let's see, why do you think that is? Let's see, is Nathan Becker here?
Yeah, so because how like your linear fit is doing it, it's trying to make like the function go through x bar, y bar. So it kind of makes sense that the center matches, but the slope could change.
Okay. Yeah, maybe another way to say it is like, if all the line did is move straight up and down, then you would have equal error bars everywhere. But if the line tilts at all around its center, you're going to get bigger errors on the edges than in the middle. And that's what's happening. It's shifting up and down, but it's also tilting. And so that kind of is sort of an intuitive explanation for why these are a little bit bigger than these. Okay. Next question. Based on our definition of bias, let's let's see. So bias, just to remind you, this is the definition of bias. Is y equal to y hat on average for a particular x? Okay, so if we're focusing on this particular x is 0.5, is this model biased? Let's see, is Jacob Brees here?
Yeah.
All right, yeah, so what do you think? Is it biased or unbiased for that x?
For the x.
For x is 0.5.
I would say it is pretty biased.
Yeah, and why are you saying that?
Like it's choosing like way close to its prediction.
Okay,
I don't know how.
okay, so what I was looking for is the bias, which is the difference between y hat and y, is simply the gap between the green and red. So this is the true y. This is the true y, like on average, right? Because actually the true y has noise in it. So the true y is half the time it's above this, half the time below this. But this red curve is the average true y because you're averaging out that zero mean noise. So this is the average y, right there. This is the average y hat. That's how we define the green line. So if I want to know the bias, I look at the difference between red and green, and I find that at that x, it's biased. So what about this x right here? Or what about 0? Is it biased at 0? No, right? Actually, the green and red match up perfectly. So here you can see why we were looking at this as a function of x. Because for some x, there actually might be no difference on average between the true and predicted targets, but at other x, there may be. And what we really want is that there's no difference for any x. Okay. I think inevitably you can find some x for which you kind of get lucky. That yeah, on average, that for that particular x, I'm getting the right the targets to match the truth, the target, predicted target, and true to match. But at other x, maybe not. So we want to see if this is true at all x. Okay, the second question is, where do I see the variance reflected on the green curve? Well, the way we constructed this green error bar is that the error bar is just the square root of that variance. So if we're saying again, at x is 0.5, and we want to know what is the variance of our prediction, it's just how much is it wiggling around its average. Okay. This has nothing to do with the truth now. This is just how much is it varying around its average. So that's what those error bars tell us. Okay, so the the variance of our model is seen by these error bars, the green ones. And the bias is the gap between the red and green curves. And the mean squared error is the sum of that variance and the squared bias. So those two things add to give you the mean squared error. Okay, plus the irreducible error, sigma squared. Okay. Okay, so is this making sense, this picture here? So I think this picture really helps to explain what is going on in this derivation. All right, any questions on the picture? Okay, yes.
So we see that in some places the bias is positive, in others the bias is negative.
Yes, exactly.
In expectation, does that not cancel out? Like,
Depends what you're doing your expectation over, but like if you were doing your expectation over x, then yes, it cancels out. And that is exactly why it's not meaningful to look at the bias unless you condition on x. Because like you just pointed out, if based on the symmetry of this, the difference between the red and green, it's symmetric. So if I do an expectation, and let's say my x's are also symmetrically distributed, it would look like the bias is 0, right? But it's not. There's a persistent error. Like whenever we're at 0.5, we are persistently above the truth. Whenever minus 0.5, we're persistently below the truth. That matters. So that's why it's super important to condition when you evaluate bias. Yeah. Okay. Great. Any other questions? Okay, so let's move on to the middle column now. So in the middle column, z equals 1. Now we have d equals 3. So what's really interesting about this curve? Well, the green is right on top of the red everywhere. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of bias? Let me ask, is Sarah Hutter here? Okay, what about Jacob Isaman? What about Kevin Kim? Okay, what about Jack Lanza?
Here.
All right.
So in this case, for the d equals 3, you're not seeing a bias there, 'cause there's no difference between the red and green.
Exactly. For any x I look at, no matter what x is, oops, no matter what x is, there's no gap, which is fantastic, right? It means, like, on average, our predictions are always correct no matter what x is. Now, that does not mean that every time I run an experiment, I'm getting the right answer. No, because even though the average prediction is correct, the instantaneous prediction is deviating from that average, and that's what these error bars show us. So here again, the error bars are a bit higher on the edges than they are in the middle, and that shows you that the variance is also dependent on x. It's not the same everywhere. But yeah, it's kind of amazing that here, in this case, d equals 3, we have no bias. And this does happen more generally. We'll talk about more situations where this can happen. Okay, any questions on this one? Yes.
Sorry, maybe I'm just completely missing something. Could you explain why it's medium variance here versus the last?
Oh yeah, I guess we didn't talk about that. So if we compare the error bars on the left and the error bars in the middle, they're a little bit taller. I don't know, right? Like, look at this one. Look at this one. It's not a huge amount, but they're a little bit taller. So as we, why?
Yeah.
We will. I'll show you on the next slide. Okay. Yeah. So, but this is also a trend. It's a trend that we can see empirically here happening. Okay. Everybody good with the middle? Okay, let's move on to the right one. So in the right one, this is maybe the most interesting. So this is the case where we're using that 14-order polynomial model, which is kind of crazy. It's like way more complex than we need. It wiggles around a crazy amount. And what's happening here is, first of all, is this biased or unbiased? So let's see, is Mitchell Leroy here? What about Vincent Lin? Oh, yeah. What do you think, Vincent? Is this unbiased at d equals 14? No bias? Yeah. No bias is the same as unbiased. Yes, exactly. The green average curve is completely covering the red one. There's a little bit of a gap here, but it's basically because 100,000 wasn't enough to really make those agree. If I would have run maybe like 10 million, maybe you would have covered it up. But what's most interesting here is, as we go from here to here, the variance is going up considerably, especially around the edges, right? We have like huge variance here, crazy variances on the edges. So this is because when you compute this 14-order model, towards the edges, it is doing crazy things in trying to fit the data. And that is reflected here. Even though on average it's doing the right thing, from experiment to experiment, it's doing crazy things, really crazy. And this is, again, the trend. We go from low variance to medium variance to high variance as we increase that model complexity. Okay. All right, so hopefully this helps to make sense about why we're caring about these and what they mean. Any last question about these? Yes.
I mean, so why wouldn't, for our bias term, if we wouldn't want it to cancel out, why wouldn't we like square the inside of that, kind of like variance, right? Because like variance is squared, not just to like kind of weigh outliers, but also so that it doesn't cancel out.
I guess I'm not sure what you mean. So like these things just come out of a derivation. So we take this quantity, which we want, which is sort of like the main thing we want to minimize, and we just sort of rearranged it and out popped like kind of a decomposition of that into three different things. One of them, irreducible. The second, how close we are to the truth on average. Third, how close are we to our average prediction. So that's just one particular way to split this apart. And so I don't know, with that, can you clarify your question? Like,
Maybe I'll ask.
okay, yeah.
So I have a question. So the irreducible error, would that be like when you go to the d equals 1, would that be the smallest error bar you see there? Or would you be able to see that on the plot at all?
I don't know if it's the smallest one, but it's not, I don't think it's visible in the plot because so even if, well, maybe it would be, yeah. So what I was going to say is like, even if we got this polynomial model perfectly, for every x, we're perfectly predicting the noiseless part of y. We can never predict that independent noise. So that is always there. It's unpredictable. And that is what's leading to this irreducible error term. So, so basically, yeah, I think you would see it here in terms of, let's see, would you see? No, I guess you don't see it on these plots because, so what we're showing here is this is the deviation from our average y hat. So what I'm saying is like if I came up with a model f hat that just takes the features and evaluates the polynomial, and if I fix x, I'm always going to get the same y hat. Right? So there will be no difference in my y hats. My variance will actually be 0. But the targets are moving around, and that is what is giving the irreducible error. Yeah. Yeah, this has nothing to do with the truth, with the true labels. This is purely how much the predictions are varying around their mean. Okay, great questions. Any more questions? Okay, so so to try to answer a little bit more about why the variance is increasing, we can answer that if we do a variation on our derivation that is a little bit more narrow in terms of its scope. So this derivation was extremely general. We assume nothing about f, nothing about f hat, nothing about the noise distribution, nothing about the distribution on the x's. No assumptions were made. And still we get, this decomposition. Okay, so now to make